Hey guys, it's Charles and welcome to Good Clinical, a podcast and YouTube channel dedicated to showcasing the future of medicine and human health. Today's episode is another in our partnership with Te Titoki Mataora, and today's guest is Professor Grant Searchfield. Grant is a professor of audiology at the University of Auckland, as well as founder and scientific director at TrueSilence Therapeutics. Professor Searchfield, in partnership with Te Titoki Mataora, is developing a non-invasive method for the treatment of tinnitus. Very much a unmet need, isn't it, Professor Searchfield?
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, it's a very common complaint within New Zealand and the world. About 50 million Americans experience it, and around, over 16% of New Zealanders over 65 experience it to some degree. Can have various effects, of course. Some people are really not bothered by it too much, but others are really affected by it a great deal.
Gosh, so 50 million Americans, that's 15% circa.
Yeah,
of the
so,
population.
the prevalence ranges from around about 10% to 30%, depending on how you define what tinnitus actually is. And so we see it as really quite a prevalent complaint. And for example, in some populations, the US military is an example, it's the number one disability claim amongst US veterans.
Right. And so the onset of tinnitus is typically an injury to either the brain or part of the components of the ear?
Yeah, it's either an ear or a head injury. For most people, it's of gradual onset. But if you're exposed to a loud sound, an explosion, or long-term noise exposure, you can develop it. And if it's combined with a head injury and a traumatic event, then stress-related responses combine to actually elevate it from just being a sound to something that's really important for the individual. And so there is a stress response that actually goes with the tinnitus as well.
Wow. And what's happening in that stress response?
Yeah,
So is it aggravating an underlying damage to the machinery of the ear?
Well, what actually happens is that our auditory system, or hearing, is really a survival sense. So it enables us to hear our environment and to sample it for background sounds. We're continuously looking, or hearing in this case, for threats. We don't think about that, but that's what the auditory system is doing 24/7. And so the emotional response that would go with a threat is very highly tied in to tinnitus. So when we experience tinnitus, if we're anxious about it, then it gets elevated above being just a neutral sound to something that's incredibly important that we have to heavily focus in on.
Yeah, interesting. So everything is so richly interconnected, isn't it?
Yeah, look, tinnitus is a great example of a network problem.
Yeah.
And from a clinical perspective, in many ways, treatments have been a little bit like a whack-a-mole, the game where you try and nail a particular part of the problem, but it pops up somewhere else. And tinnitus is a lot like that. Being a network problem, multiple different parts of the auditory system and brain are involved, and consequently, it's very different from individual to individual, and trying to identify where that difference is for a person becomes incredibly important in the treatment.
So historically, have we treated tinnitus with kind of like a single treatment paradigm? I mean, you just paste over an issue with all people?
The traditional approach is either trying to deal with the sound itself by covering it with another sound, right? And that's really sort of a palliative type of care, Yes, this other sound I'm listening to is better than the tinnitus, but I really still like the tinnitus not to be there. Or the other approach is to try and to deal with the symptoms, the stress, the depression, the anxiety. So a more of a psychological approach. So if you like, a bottom-up and a top-down approach. But these are going to vary in success relative to person to where the complaints are and where in the brain is really driving the activity. So this one-size-fits-all approach has really been challenged recently, where we're trying to look to more tailored, personalised approaches. In many ways, I suppose, learning from cancer treatments, where the importance of the individual's physiology is giving us a lot more information on how to target specific types of cancers. So we're trying to do that in our work.
Yeah. So just to really summarize it, you've got some damage to either the apparatus of the ear and or the brain, depending on what part of the brain and what part of the ear, and some of the other sensitivities of the individual will result in you've got the ringing sound, which is the hallmark of tinnitus, but then there's other downstream impacts. You mentioned the stress, depression, frustration, all that kind of jazz.
So, the sound itself is an important part of it, and people, say they hear the ringing. Of course, they can hear all sorts of other sounds as well, hissing, buzzing. And often it actually has a spatial aspect. So people will hear it more on one side of the head than another, or some people can even sense it localizes to somewhere close to the head.
Yeah.
Then there's the interpretation of that. Is this something that's just a mild annoyance and I can actually control that? Or has it taken the forefront of focus and attention and consequently is driving a lot of the depressive anxiety effects? One of the main impacts, for example, is sleep. Where a person will lie in bed, they're having difficulty sleeping, and the sound there continuously just is another reason why they can't head off back to sleep. So it's a combination of all sorts of different things, which makes it a fascinating area, but also one in which it becomes very difficult to actually treat.
Yeah. So if you were to design the perfect treatment for tinnitus, first of all, it has to be personalised based on the patient's needs, also the original injury that caused that percolated this. If you were to design it, what would you be going after? How would you be administering it? Because I imagine it's not like an eardrop that you pop in that's going to mask the sound.
The idea that you could turn the sound off by a drug at the ear or even surgery has been tried, where people have tried to cut the auditory nerve and turn the tap off between the ear and the brain, the assumption being that the ear was causing the problem. But when surgery like that has been done, tinnitus often remained, so it was actually centralised and moved from being an ear problem into being in the brain. And of course, one of the consequences of cutting the nerve is you can't hear. Yeah. So you're left with this horrible sound that you can't interfere with sound. So whatever we come up with has to be very carefully tailored to the origins of the tinnitus and look beyond the ear into the way that the brain interprets and signals activation. We've got a number of different ways that we could potentially do that. The ideal would be a medication. Currently, we're quite a way off that. Medication's been tried, and for some individuals, there's a signal of potential, but for the vast majority of people, it hasn't had an effect. The ideas of using magnetic or electrical stimulation of the brain to try and shut down areas of the brain haven't really proven effective in terms of being a treatment. Interesting from research, but they don't tend to target all the areas of the brain.
Yeah. Is that like deep brain stimulation that have been used?
Sometimes deep brain stimulation with an electrode actually deep in the brain has been tried. Low-level electrical stimulation, what's called transcranial direct current stimulation, has been tried, and also transcranial magnetic stimulation. And these don't involve surgery. A magnet is a very strong magnet, is placed near the head to try and change the underlying physiology of the brain, or in the case of direct current stimulation, just a very low-level current applied to the skin with the idea that it will move through the skull and through the brain and try and change the electrical activity. But those effects are very fleeting and they don't last. So where we have looked in the absence of an effective medication and these short-term treatments is to look at using a combination of treatments. Sound to try and influence the bottom-up activity within the auditory system. perceptual training to try and train the brain to actually treat the tinnitus as an insignificant sound that can be ignored, and then making sure that people can manage their psychological effects that come with the tinnitus, so the anxiety and the focus on attention through counselling, mindfulness, and other means there. So we really think that what holds the most promise in the future is effectively a polytherapeutic approach, where for an individual, one particular therapy may be important, but another one may be more important, and that may change from individual to individual. Also, we believe that as the tinnitus evolves and the treatment takes effect, the treatment may actually have to change with time. So there may be a plateauing of an effect where most effect is achieved within a few weeks with one treatment, and that's not going to make any further benefit. You have to change tack and follow that up with another treatment. So this idea of a very nuanced, smart treatment that adjusts for the individual over time is really where we think we can make great strides.
That's fascinating. I really hooked into that when you said that those experiments around the cutting of the auditory nerve, the hypothesis being that the damage is in the ear, so if you cut the connection, then it should be fine. But it migrated out of the ear and into the brain. So, I mean, obviously there's a lot of like back and forth between those two organs. But that's fascinating. So if you take that to its logical conclusion, that a bit like with this polytherapy and changing over time, there's likely going to be changes, this whack-a-mole, this squeezing of a water balloon,
Absolutely.
But would that suggest that it's just going to be there's no cure to this? It would likely be a management that evolves over time?
The question around a cure is always an important one, because this is what people want. People want a cure, and we understand that. They really want to be able to go to see their GP and receive a course of pills that will take it away. We've become used to that, and that's a reasonable goal. I'm not saying that we won't get that. I think that rather than a cure, we're more likely to have cures, and that might be a series of different treatments. And I think a key to this is actually understanding what's going on and being able to monitor that. And one of the great problems that we've had with tinnitus is the ability to measure it in terms of identifying where or what has been going on with the tinnitus in the hearing system. So research tends to indicate that after the onset of tinnitus, there's probably a period of 6 to 12 weeks where it still remains an ear problem.
Right.
After that time, the brain begins to react to the changes that have occurred in the ear, and it becomes part of the central processing of the brain, and the brain has a memory of what that is and tries to compensate for that. So a drug might have a window, if it was acting on the ear, of perhaps a couple of months. The problem there is that most people, when they develop tinnitus, don't go and see anybody about it, because they may have experienced temporary tinnitus before, but it's gone.
Yeah.
And so the logical thing to do would be, okay, it's going to go.
Wait and see.
It's going to go, and often it does. So capturing that window of time medically is very difficult. So I think we have to look beyond that for most people if we can't capture that time, and we need to understand how different parts of the brain connect. We have to look at how different parts of the brain are responsible for tinnitus. In some cases, one region will be having greater activity than another, and how do we influence that? And we can do that by trying to train the parts of the brain, by influencing it with sound, or surprisingly even vision in the case of audition. We think tinnitus is a sound problem, but we can influence it with visual information as well. Looking at that, but maybe we'll actually be able to fast track some of those changes that may take several months now, actually by priming the system with a medication. So you provide a medication and then you follow it with sound, or sound and then a medication. The combination of therapies is probably the next step before we can really come up with a single cure.
Gotcha. That's fascinating. So if you can, what kind of drug would be involved in that first 6 to 12 weeks? So that's essentially dumbing down any signal that the ear is essentially sending to the brain, that the brain would then react to, and it would change the way it would respond and then migrate that tinnitus in there.
So the main signaling pathway from the inner ear up to the brain is based on glutamate, which is a neurotransmitter. So generally what drugs have tried to do is to block that activity. And this seems to be successful in some animal-based research, and I've been involved in some research where a pilot study had very successful results, but when we went to clinical trial, it didn't. One of the complicating factors with drug research, well, all tinnitus research, is really that tinnitus has a very large placebo effect as well. And so you think you might be doing well if you apply something, but when you actually also incorporate placebo, you get similar effects. And so this ultimately is really the judge of whether you're seeing an effect above really convincing the person that what they're doing is going to have a benefit and them feeling better, is to actually see that action. So the 12 weeks is probably in and around that space. It's possible that if you could remove the damage, right? And that damage is often going to be associated with a hearing loss as well. So if you could biologically, physiologically reverse hearing loss or the pre-hearing loss changes that arise in tinnitus, you might be able to actually solve tinnitus that way as well. And so there is a lot of interesting work looking at regrowing the hearing cells and seeing if that might assist things. The risk is that you might regrow the hearing cells, but they rewire in a way that potentially could actually create tinnitus as well. So, this is a finely tuned system. So most of the emphasis now has really moved from the ear into the brain and these networks that become established after 6 to 12 weeks. And when we see people that have chronic bothersome tinnitus, it's this network or these networks that are really maintaining the tinnitus as something at the forefront of attention.
And when the damage or the issue lies in the brain, it's not going to be one part of the brain. There's multiple parts of the brain that are involved in the kind of auditory center, shall we say. And depending on where the activity is there, I imagine the approach would be different in some of these alternative modalities.
Absolutely. So as our knowledge and our ability to have a look at brain activity has progressed in new methodologies, we have begun to see this movement from idea of it's an ear problem. Well, no, it's a brain pathway problem, auditory problem. Well, actually, no, it's not just that there are other pathways in the brain involved in that as well. For example, the part of the brain involved in spatial attention, part of the brain in pattern perception, part of the brain involved in emotion and focus, and part of the brain that's involved in just how we are on our daily basis, what we call the default network. All these parts of the brain are always active, and the traditional view of the brain was based on anatomical injuries, where you'd have a damage to the part of the brain and you'd lose a function. But we're now learning that it's much more nuanced than that, and tinnitus very much is a whole of network problem. If we could identify a single region driving the tinnitus, then there might be this possibility of using, for example, the electrical stimulation or the magnetic stimulation just to suppress that region. But it seems like you do that, but other activity begins to emerge. And, when we're talking about brain activity, it's really important to understand we're not actually talking about pathology. We're not talking about parts of the brain degrading or not working. It's actually the brain working, but a little bit too well.
Right.
in this survival sense. So, you know, we hear a threatening signal. What we want our brain to do is to identify what's causing that and help us survive. And that's going to be done very well by people that tend to be a little bit more anxious. I often say, look, if you're out in the wilderness, having a person with tinnitus in your tribe is probably quite good, because they're probably the people that are going to be looking out and protecting you from those threats in their environment. They're a little bit more anxious, so they're going to hear a threatening sound and react to it.
Interesting.
They're hearing the tinnitus and they're reacting to it.
Yeah.
It's not that the brain is doing anything abnormal. It's just functional, and it's just taken on too much importance. And so information feeding into the auditory system and from the auditory system, from these survival parts of the brain, are meaning that the person can't let it go. And some people can. But for the person that has it as a great problem, their survival mechanisms are in their top mode of operating, and they're in, you know, one of the high gears powering down the motorway on it. And we really need to change down and lower that level of arousal. And if we can do that, the brain can subside its activity, and we get to the point where the brain has to make a decision, is that sound actually there or not? Because other sounds in the environment may actually take priority then. If that occurs, then even though there is some tinnitus-related activity there, the brain won't be aware of it, and it's pushed into a subconscious level, and we don't hear it.
Amazing. Because I always wonder about these kind of things, you know, like surely there's some kind of evolutionary significance around this. I mean, it has persisted throughout, you know, the millennia to get us to this point, and now it's here in modern day life. Obviously, throughout most of our human history, we didn't have loud explosions, or we didn't, you know, have big, massive car accidents. Surely we'd fall, we'd have falls, or we'd fight, whatever that could obviously cause that damage. But it's really interesting how there might have been some kind of survival benefit bestowed on someone or a group of people that had tinnitus.
Well, you know, this level of normal anxiety is around trying to protect us, and obviously people range from, hey, I'm cool, I'm chilled, you know, I'm totally relaxed sort of person, to those people that are more anxious, and over time this hasn't mattered so much. You know, in today's world we're so protective, but you can imagine a situation where you did have to be very aware of your environment. The sound of a twig snapping in the bushes could be the difference between you surviving or, you know, a saber-toothed tiger coming out and grabbing you. So there is this. Now, where does tinnitus come into that? Well, we do know that tinnitus has existed, well, we believe it has, in very early medical texts. So there are papyrus medical records talking about singing in the ear, and the view that this was something that was very important. Now, loud noises, you know, didn't have the explosions there, but ear infections, common medical infections that we can now treat with antibiotics, would have been highly prevalent. And so that would have been the driver for tinnitus. And so there are all sorts of incantations and rudimentary medical treatments for tinnitus that have existed there. Thankfully, we've moved on from there into some more scientific basis. But I don't think we can totally pull out that survival mechanism from the physiology. We are now becoming very much focused on mechanistic approaches because we can measure the brain. And, you know, these sorts of things are reflected in brain activity. They're not removed from that. So we can see survival mechanisms in EEG recordings or brain-related activity. But it's heavily tied in there. So, you know, it's really interesting that something that we may not think we're using on a daily basis is actually contributing to this really highly annoying, problematic auditory problem.
Yeah. So why don't we pivot to the solution that you're working on with the support of Te Titoki Mataora.
Yeah.
So you're now at the Rapid Accelerator program phase 3.
Yeah.
So that's the point of developing a novel working prototype that can then
then actually go out into practice and be used,
which
is really exciting.
Very, very exciting stuff. So you've rep 1, rep 2, that's been done. So that's the early work, the validation of the market, intellectual property, the commercial, drivers behind such a technology. But now it's like, this is where the rubber's kind of meeting the road before.
Yeah. So, the process has been, for me, I've been researching tinnitus for 25, 30 years. Basically, it's been my career. But what we're actually getting to the point with is, wow, this is actually, going to be meaningful now. A lot of the early work was fundamental, foundational. We've got to the point where we've been able to use new clinical protocols, and that's great. But really where this has started with investment and coming up with a clinical treatment, this is where TrueSilence comes into the picture, and where we've developed a digital therapeutic, right? And the input into that digital therapeutic currently is based on individuals' goals with treatment, so behavioural measures, and that drives the selection of the appropriate treatment based on the person's needs. But we think we can take that to the next level and actually use biosensors. So the biosensors that we're using, people will be familiar with biosensors, actually, Fitbits or their phone, the number of steps you're taking or your heart rate.
Don't Apple have a patent around biosensors and AirPods?
Yeah, no, fantastic. And there are a number of these around recording from the head. And this is where our TTM project has picked up. We've got this treatment. We want to make it really smart. We'd already done some work where we knew that we could predict if a person was going to benefit or not from a treatment, right? So that's great, with really quite high accuracy just from recording their brain activity. And we do that from EEG. EEG is electrical activity of the brain. We just record it from little stickers or what are called electrodes, but they just sit on the surface of the head. They don't hurt or anything like that. They sit on the head. And we're able to record that and say, actually, you've got a high probability of benefiting from this treatment or not. That's valuable because the treatments, as I've already mentioned, can take quite a long time. So you don't want to do a treatment if it's not going to work, right? Okay. Sure. But, that's quite a coarse categorization. Where our motivation for this adventure that we've launched along with the funding, with the RAP3 funding, is we believe that we can record from a few regions on the head, then we can in real time use that information to inform the treatment. Not just, is this going to benefit you or not, but actually say, at this particular point in time, this treatment is going to be most beneficial. Look, your brain activity has changed, probably because of what you're doing or your situation. Now this treatment is going to be beneficial. So we're looking in real time at recordings of cardiac-related activity, which is usually a good indicator of stress levels, brain activity and brain region activity, which can help tell us, okay, this part of the tinnitus network is activated or not. And by pulling all this sort of information together, we are, with the help of machine learning, dare I say it, artificial intelligence, able to extract patterns. And with these patterns be able to say, you've got this pattern of activity now, based on all the data we have, the best match for improvement with that pattern of activity is this treatment. The treatment can then respond to that. After a period of time, the activity in the brain or heart-related activity may change. The treatment can adapt with that. So what we're moving from is a highly effective treatment that takes some time and requires the person to give some cues as to how they're feeling, to something that is picking up the biological signals and responding in real time. And so where we're at with that is we've been able to move from the research situation where we're recording from 64 electrodes on the head, which is not really practical, because it takes a good period of time to actually set that up, and it looks ridiculous, and you can't wear it at home, to something where we are shrinking it down. And a current headset, we're recording from 8 positions.
Oh, wow.
It's possible that we'll be able to use those 8 positions and then actually transition to something just recording from the ear. So you mentioned the Apple patent. We may be able to do some very complicated mathematical modelling. So we take a whole of head recording, but then we fill that gap up so that when the person goes home, we can just rely on the activity coming from the ears. And if we do that, we can actually record things like heart rate, skin temperature, skin conductance, all the cool things that we can measure biological activity just from the ear. One of the papers that I read, I really thought this was a good way of thinking about it, is the author referred to the ears as the USB plug to the brain, all right, because it's a plug. It's easy to put things in there, and it's a great place to record brain activity from. So if we think about that,
incredible.
It's better than on your wrist. It's also convenient, and perhaps the future holds that we'll all be wearing these sorts of devices, and it's just that the way that they're used is manipulated for what we want. For some people, it'll be tinnitus. For some people, it'll be hearing loss. For some people, it'll just help us hear at the bar when we're at the pub. And it'll be monitoring our activity. And maybe, we'll walk along the street and it'll say, actually, are you looking for a coffee? There's a great coffee shop around the corner.
Right. So this kind of, you're putting together a paradigm of all the different attributes of an individual: brain activity, regional brain activity, skin conductance, heart rate, temperature, X, Y, and then from that, you from the research you've done to date, the most appropriate treatment paradigm for that patient.
Well, we've got a pretty good idea.
Right.
And now what we need to do is weed through the information. We have to say, actually, some of these measurements are interesting, but they don't help with tinnitus.
I see, yeah.
So the process of saying, what can we record, get as much information we've got, link that to treatments, and then begin to say, okay, what are the patterns that we're seeing? This particular measurement doesn't seem to be so helpful.
Like get the minimum viable set of variables. You don't want to measure 100 when you can get away with 5.
Absolutely. And when we boil it down to really the meaningful things, we can put it into practice and acquiring data. And data, numbers, are the really important things for this. So when we've got something that is wearable, practical, which we have now achieved, we're testing it. Can we record? Yes. Is it as good as other systems out there? Yes. Great. Okay. So now we've got something that works. We can actually record the data and begin to gather all that data and link it in to the treatment. And that's when we really begin to get commercial interest, because they then can see, okay, there actually is a proposition where this can be moved from the laboratory, from theory to the clinic. And with the clinic, there becomes then a potential commercial interest. And in order to get it to the clinic, whether we like it or not, there has to be the investment. And the investment is going to be coming from entrepreneurs who say, actually, I can see this working and I can see a return. So this aspect of commercialization and getting it into practice, which as a scientist, 10 years ago, I would have been incredibly naive to the whole process. Through engagement with commercial aspects, I'm beginning to understand more about the realities of this and how to move it from an idea into something that actually people are benefiting from. And there does need to be this lubrication through commercial means. TTM, the RAP process, has enabled us to take an idea with a little bit of risk associated with it from a funding perspective to prove it works. Now, to take it to the next level, we're saying, okay, we're going to commercialize it. We need people to come in and share our vision for where this can go and to see it, really realized.
I mean, it's really an exciting an exciting inflection point, right? That where the project
so
is, right?
cool.
I mean, it's just you're on the cusp of something truly great that can be in the clinic. So what would that look like once it's in the clinic? Is it something that is easily administered by an audiologist with their patient, get a few readings? Okay, we choose treatment A for you, go away, do the treatment yourself in the comfort of your own home, get some feedback data over the course of the treatment, and then 3 months later, do another reading with an audiologist.
Yeah, well, that is a really important aspect of it. We think the engagement with the clinician is really important because there are a number of medical and audiological aspects of this that have to be there. But also we want to empower the end user, and also we don't want to make this expensive. We want to try and make it accessible to people as possible because we know that there's a huge unmet need. So the first product from TrueSilence Therapeutics, which is involved around this behavioural input. Basically, a person would see their clinician, they'd have some tests done. That information would be then uploaded onto a computer that the clinician could manipulate. The information would then be downloaded to the end user's phone as a digital therapeutic. So the user's phone is the important part of the hardware. That would then link to some headphones and a speaker that we have chosen and designed to work really well with our setup. And then they would go away. Every day they'd be asked how you're feeling. Every few days they can provide input by completing some questions on the application on the digital therapeutic on their phone that would then manipulate the therapy. So see the clinician potentially once, and then they take control and they have the sense of control, and the therapy will evolve with the information that they're providing. Now, the next generation, which we're doing with TTM's help, is that some of that behavioural information where me as the end user is entering it in will be done automatically. And rather than having to change the input every 5 days, it can be done on the fly.
I see.
Now, to start out with, that might be we do a recording with the EEG recording at the clinic, and the person may take home a wearable headset, which is a very simplified, easy to use cap. And they use that in certain situations, not all of them, because we can't see people, walking down the street yet with what we've got. But at home and quiet, we're asking people to undertake some of our training tasks, our perceptual training tasks. They're going to be sitting at home anyway. So using it in that environment and the system can learn. Ultimately, these things will shrink. They become smaller. We don't have to even say, will they? We know that the technology will get smarter and smaller and so on. And so we just gather our information, and when the technology enables, we'll jump on that and be able to learn that. So we see a future where a person is using something that everybody else is wearing, but the system that they're employing is helping with their tinnitus. When that might be, the biosensor stuff is just around the corner. It may be that the wearable, easily day-to-day biosensor stuff that we're talking about is just 5 years around the corner, certainly 10 years. Yeah. And the therapy that we've got now is fantastic and it works, and we're just looking to make it that much better.
Yeah. So with these like AI-based large, what are they called, models? You need a huge amount of data to support them, right? And then the AI can interrogate it, tease it out, make associations, find out so I suppose you're at the point now where you need as much data as possible. You need as many willing participants with tinnitus to come along and put their hand and say, hey,
absolutely.
let me have this device.
And some of that can be gathered if people volunteer, using the treatment system that currently exists, so that we gather that data, and if they're willing to share that, great, we can use that. And then there are the experimental studies. The good news is the changes that we're actually talking about in the brain seem consistent enough, although there's variation between people, but consistent enough that even a moderate amount of data can help inform this, Right. So rather than tens of thousands, data in the thousands of people is probably going to be enough for us to basically inform these models. Of course, the more data, the smarter and the smarter, because different scenarios can be considered. But I think we're onto really a bit of a winner in the way that we're approaching things. And a lot of people have contributed to this. This is not just my work. There are a number of folks from the University of Auckland, AUT University, feeding into this project. And like, I'm an audiologist. I'm a simple audiologist, and the essence of it. I understand tinnitus. I really don't understand artificial intelligence. I understand a little bit about EEG, but it's not native to me. I don't really understand about design and development. How do you make these things? How do you turn them into reality? I can't code. So there's multiple people that have to come into play. And, networks like we have within the MedTech ecosystem within New Zealand is a huge advantage. We may be small, but we've got all the elements that we need, and it's a matter of pulling those together. And my area of research has really benefited from those collaborations. It's been huge. It's been the real deal breaker in terms of actually saying, okay, move this from sort of a crazy idea into reality and moving that along rather rapidly. So investment from TTM and this whole process has been fantastic. It's been incredibly important to where we have been and what we've been able to achieve up to now.
Yeah, absolutely. Grant, this has been really, really interesting. If people want to find out more about you, TrueSilence, the project, where can they go?
Yeah, so gettruesilence.com is the commercial website that we have for that particular product. People are very welcome to reach out to me at the university. Very happy to take interested calls if people want to volunteer for research. We've got a volunteer database, and of course through Te Titoki Mataora and that network there. Fantastic organisation, and they can help navigate to find me.
Awesome. Well, all the best. Thank you so much.